I'm Victoria Lichtendorf, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our second keynote address this summer for our Clarice Smith National Teacher Institutes here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I also want to welcome anyone who's joining us online. I do want to mention for those of you joining us online, you may notice that some of the sound on the videos that will be played is missing, but fear not, in our archived version, it will return. So I just wanted to mention that. Given the Institute's focus on exploring creative approaches to teaching and the rich opportunities afforded by integrating American art into the core curriculum, our speaker today, Ron Ritchhart, was a natural choice. So we were truly thrilled to find out that yes, indeed, he could join us today, and that he'll be speaking about creating powerful learning opportunities by integrating art into the classroom. A senior research associate at Harvard Project Zero, Ron focuses on such issues as teaching for understanding, the development of intellectual character, creative teaching, making students' thinking visible, and most recently, the development of school and classroom culture. Ron's research and writings have informed the work of schools, school systems, and museums throughout the world. His current work focuses on how classrooms change as teachers strive to make thinking valued, visible, and actively promoted in their classrooms. This research is explored in his latest book, Making Thinking Visible, written with Mark Church and Karin Morrison, which takes readers inside a diverse range of learning environments to show how thinking can be made more visible at any level and across all subject areas through the use of effective questioning, listening, documentation, and facilitative structures called thinking routines. Many of these are actually, in fact, the same skills and strategies we will be exploring in this week's Institute. Please note, after the talk, Ron will have some time to take questions, at which point we just ask you to raise your hand so that a staff person can bring around a microphone. Again, this is being webcast. We want to capture what it is you're asking. And before turning it over to Ron, I would like to especially thank the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation, whose generous gift supports the Clarice Smith American Art Education Initiative. Thank you all for being here. Ron?
Switch on. Right. Well, welcome everyone. And clearly we've all brought really good energy to the city. You know, now that the budget impasse is kind of hopefully over. So another kind of opportunity being created there. So a lot of things which Victoria mentioned are things which I'm going to be talking about, drawing from my research in classrooms today to kind of set up some of your week in terms of the learning. So the idea of creating powerful learning opportunities, I want to begin by kind of talking about what it is that we as teachers do. And you know, the language that we use to talk about what we do, the idea that we, you know, design units and write lesson plans and come up with assignments, that's kind of the language of teaching for the most part. But I think that it would be useful for us to shift and to modify our language slightly, because what I think we really do is we create opportunities for learning. That when we are designing a unit, when we are writing a lesson plan, even when we're pulling a teacher resource book off the shelf and deciding to do one activity over another, we do that because of the opportunities that are there. So are there opportunities for children to confront their misconceptions? Are there opportunities for them to push and move their thinking forward? You know, are there opportunities for them to discuss and explore ideas? So it's those opportunities that we really want to kind of look at. So our focus today is going to be on, well, what is it that really makes those opportunities powerful? And we're going to look at that. So to begin with, to kind of help us think about that question, we're going to take a look at a video. This teacher's name is Leslie Revis. She is a high school Spanish teacher. And we're going to watch in a Spanish 3 class. Now, I know that you know, you are humanities teachers and not Spanish teachers, but sometimes it's very useful to look at something that we don't teach because it enables us to kind of look at it with fresh eyes and to kind of see into that. So as we're watching this, there are two questions I want you to think about that we'll talk about afterwards. So the first question is to think about, well, how do you know that students in Leslie's classroom, what is it that makes you have that sense that they are really learning versus just doing work? So what is it that lets you know that they are actually learning there? And the second question is, well, what is it that makes that stuff, all the activities and things they're doing, what is it that makes that powerful or potentially powerful? And we'll talk about those two things after we watch the video.
Fantástico. Satira, perdón. Annie contestó. Annie estaba apasionada en el momento. She was impassioned over the question. I'm sorry, she answered. Okay. Annie? What? She lost her passion already. Okay. I have a real strong desire to create community in my classroom. Number one, we're all together for a whole year. I want it to be very real, and I want my students to be really comfortable. Rayas rojas. Language classes are huge, and one would ask oneself, how could we teach language to all these people at one time and help them to achieve their goals and become proficient with the language? The only way I thought that that could happen possibly was to break the large groups into smaller groups. De los derechos del niño, okay? Sí? My centers are theme and activity based because it motivates not only myself but my students to discover the theme.
In patio or in el patio? And
it's functionally based in the sense that you will develop certain language skills. They become not secondary, but a platform in which you develop higher thinking skills, higher levels of reasoning and understanding.
Hola, mi nombre es Shakina y soy de los Estados Unidos. Hola, mi nombre es Marina y soy de los Estados Unidos.
Hola, mi nombre es Marcos y soy de Guatemala.
Hola, mi nombre es Joey, soy de Guatemala. ¿Qué tomas adrede?
Yo tomo adrede el dinero y su adquisición porque en mi país hay muchos trabajos y hay otras organizaciones que ayudan a personas sin casas y sin comida y tiene problemas en las casas.
When we are developing ourselves in our centers, we are part of that development. Our understanding of where we've been, where we're going with our own lives, examples of what that might be in relationship to what other people in the world are going through. Young people really want to understand other people. And so when we do a comparative study between Central American children, as we did in one of the centers, and their own personal lives, I think what mostly stunned them was that Central American children were begging to go to school and not having any of the resources.
Los niños en Nicaragua y Guatemala, quien no tiene electricidad, cuando me ducho, olvido los niños no tienen agua corriente.
Correcto.
Después de miraba
De mirar.
el video, consigue. How would you say I appreciate?
Oh, aprecio, sí.
Aprecio mis cosas más.
Mucho más.
Mucho más.
Suave tener una escuela tan bonita, ¿no? Sí, es cierto. Muy bien, señorita. Is this the same group that said they couldn't speak Spanish yesterday? You are impressing me.
When it's about something you care about, I think it's easier.
It comes. It really, the passion just fills you with wanting to say what you need to say. That's right. That's what's great. Whatever our students are developing, it's real life. It's real life concepts, and I think that that's very important. We emailed the president of Guatemala about civil rights concerns. Sería bonito mandar el email hoy, eh? Hey, Mr. Prez, what about this?
I'm here today to solicit your cooperation and assistance to see if you can translate some documents for us that has to do with evacuation notices in the event that a hurricane comes about.
Leslie Revis and her class have had a very powerful impact in this community.
See? They've been able to supply Spanish translations for all of our agencies who are anxious to serve the Hispanic community. As a result of this project, I see enormous growth in these young people that Leslie's working with. They're extraordinarily proud of the work they're doing, but more importantly, I think that they're absolutely stunned to find out that they are doing something that grown-ups view as valuable.
I'm going to try to get involved in book goods, translating book goods for the hospitals and for other people that need it because they're Mexicans that come to the United States. And can I get any help because they don't understand what the book's saying or the phone numbers and stuff. So that's why I want to help out.
¿Qué representan?
Estado.
Los estados. Oh, Lamar. Eres brillante. Estados Unidos. I judge success in my classroom by the level of happiness that I see in my students, their laughter, their joy, their passion for discovery. When they are plugged in and energized and love what they're discovering and know that they can make a difference for other people, that's all they really want. They just go and go and go and go. And it's an endless journey. It's a journey full of ideas, and it's motivated and limited only by our creativity.
Okay, so would you take a couple of minutes now and just turn to the people around you and think about those two questions. So how is it that you know that Leslie's students were really learning versus just doing work? And what is it that you saw that seems powerful in that made that powerful learning as an opportunity? Whenever you watch a video of any classroom, if you are tempted to say, gee, those are just really good kids, you know, I wish those were kids, that generally there are routines and structures which are behind that, which set that up. And one of the things in my research that I found out was, not surprisingly, teachers who are very adept at that do that from day one. It starts very early. This video was shot the third week of school. So it wasn't that she had all the good kids. She teaches at a very large high school. Teaching Spanish means that she would have had some of those kids before, but not all of them. But teachers set that right away, and they set the context for learning kind of right away. So some of those ideas, I'm going to kind of pull those together and identify. There are 4 really key things that latch on to all of those points that you made. And these come from both my own research and some other people's research, and I'll kind of mention that connection as we kind of go through. So the first one is the idea of novel application. So that means that students are doing more than just practicing what they already know. They are bringing all of their skills, they are bringing that to bear in a novel situation. There's a researcher in the UK, Martin Skelton, who says that when he goes into schools and looks in classrooms, he'd say that only about 30% of what is happening there is actual learning. That most of what he sees students doing, they can already do. They are doing a lot of practicing of what they already know. And what we really want is we want kids to take those skills into novel situations, because that's how kids learn to transfer. That's how they learn to apply them. That's how they learn to really own those skills and that knowledge to push them kind of forward. So the idea of a novel application within that. The second one is the idea of meaningful inquiry. So this is the idea that there is something new which is being learned at the same time, and understanding is developing. In the Teaching for Understanding project, which we had at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, one of the things we always talked about was when students are engaged in what we called an understanding performance, something that builds understanding, it does 2 things. It both develops understanding as well as demonstrates it. So, and that's what a good assessment does as well, too. So assessments that really not only allow kids to demonstrate their understanding, but also to develop it. So there's a push there. There's a push and a chance to actually develop one's understanding. The third one here is effective communication. And we saw students in Leslie's classroom doing a lot of talking and having that chance to communicate through Spanish. And that's not a surprising thing in a language class. But what we're finding more and more is that the idea of getting kids to talk and communicate and express their ideas and express their reasons, to give their evidence, is really crucial to locking in that understanding and really enhancing it. And in the work we do in the Cultures of Thinking project, this is a key part. Making students' thinking visible demands that they actually talk, share, express, communicate. And so they are learning the language of the subject as they are engaged in doing this. And then the last part here, the idea that what students are doing has some intrinsic value. And people mentioned that in Leslie's class. There was a sense that what they were doing was worthwhile, that it had some value. It doesn't always have to have that grand value, but students feel a sense of accomplishment rather than just doing work for the teacher within that. So these 4 elements, when we think about creating powerful learning opportunities, these are the 4 elements that we want to kind of bring into that. I mentioned some other researchers, and Fred Newman did a huge study in Chicago public schools in which he looked at the assignments which students were given, the kind of stuff students were asked to do. And what he found was that students who were more regularly asked to do assignments that required these kinds of things scored better on tests of basic skills. And basically what his study was showing was, you know, the best way to prepare kids for a basic skills test is not practice, practice, practice on basic skills. The best way to prepare them is actually to give them what he calls authentic intellectual activity. And that authentic intellectual activity is what actually enables kids to consolidate their understanding, to push it forward, to stay engaged with the learning. And he found that this held true for students at all ability levels. All students, weak students, middle students, high students, all benefited from more authentic intellectual activity within that. So as we go through, I want you to keep those 4 in the background, and we're going to kind of return to these. And I want to take you into a thinking routine now, which could look like an activity, but we're going to kind of dissect it and talk about, well, how does it meet these criteria, and what's really engaged in this as we begin to kind of look at some art. And this thinking routine is called Zoom In. This was created by a colleague of mine, Rhonda Bondi, at the time working at the Library of Congress to help explore primary source documents within that, and we've kind of adapted it for our use. So we call this a thinking routine, and a thinking routine is a simple structure which helps to scaffold and support students' thinking. And that's its goal or its purpose. So to tell you a little bit more about what this thinking routine is all about and where the thinking is at, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what's the game, what's the rules of the game that we're going to be playing here as we're looking at it, as well as what we're not playing. So the game that we're actually playing here is about looking closely, noticing, interpreting, and reasoning for evidence. So as we look at these images and these parts of images and zoom into them, that's what we're going to be doing together. What we are not going to be doing, the game we're not playing, is guess this picture. So if you happen to recognize the image that we're seeing, kind of keep that to yourself. There'll be a chance for you afterwards to share what you know about the image. But if you do recognize the artist, rather than guess this picture, kind of return to that, okay, well, what new things might you notice? That quote from Thoreau up there, that idea that it's not what we look at, but what we see, and the power of seeing, and helping people to see. And this is something which students need a lot of work developing, and it has a very high transfer rate, helping students to see, to notice, and to look closely. A couple of years ago at the Harvard Medical School, they identified that one of the problems in training new doctors was that the doctors weren't very good at clinical diagnosis, that when patients presented themselves, the doctors were missing a lot. They offered the doctors a module at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, a 9-week module looking at art, noticing. And the doctors in training who participated in that developed their clinical diagnosis skills much better than those that didn't participate. So learning to look closely, to notice, and to observe has a lot of transfer across that. So in this zoom in, what I'm going to be showing you is bits of an image at a time, and we're going to build up the story around these images. And there's a series of questions that kind of go with this. And I'm going to ask you constantly to engage with these questions with a partner sitting next to you. So this first little detail here, than that. So turning with the person next to you, talk about what it is that you actually see or notice in that bit of the image. What does it look like? What does it remind you of? Okay, so someone start us off. So what are some things that you notice in that very small, little dark section of that image there? What were some things that you noticed there? See a shovel and rocks. What else? Yep. You see an abandoned shovel. Ah, you know, and that's very interesting to that we can notice things which aren't there. So you notice that it was abandoned, okay? And what does that remind you of? So when you think about that abandoned shovel.
Just wondering why nobody's using it.
Okay, so raising some questions. Why isn't anyone using it? Who belongs to that shovel? Other things that people notice or saw in there are things that it reminds them of so far.
The foreground, you can see that the background is...
Okay, so the background's very blurred, very dark. And what does that remind you of, or what sense do you get from that?
Fog, mist,
Okay.
darkness.
Creepiness, fog, mist, darkness. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you another bit of the image now. Okay, and again, turn to your partner and talk about what new things you see in that bit. Okay, again, let's come back together here. I want to point out one thing which I noticed, particularly as you were doing all of the scene and noticing. People were doing a lot of pointing, which is a really good sign that so you're helping people to see. And that idea of noticing that we often think that other people are seeing exactly what we see, but being able to kind of point things out and to raise their awareness. So what new things did people see, and how did this begin to kind of change your hypothesis about this emerging story about this image so far? It is. I'm not moving things around, so I am keeping the image constant within that. So that is the other side of the picture. You're right, within that. Okay.
You can see more foliage.
Okay, you can see more foliage. And what does that make you think about location?
That it's outside. There's more light, whereas opposed to that one, which was much darker.
Okay.
There's more life in this side of the painting. That it's brighter. It's like maybe new day-ish. You know, it's lighter than on the left. But the foliage and the tree living does contrast with the rocks, the parent rocks on the left, which seem more like dead.
Okay, so very interesting. So you've got this very kind of contrast there, this kind of dark and foreboding. You mentioned kind of dead. You've got much more life here. You see more light within that. The trees you mentioned, as well as that. Okay, let me show you the next. And we've already talked a little bit about some of those questions that were raised. So here's the next bit. Okay, and again, turn to your partner. Continue to do some noticing, but what is it that you can say about that person there? Okay, again, we'll come back together here. So what is it that you can say about this person here? What are some things you feel like you can say?
Not happy.
Not, and what makes you say that?
Well, the look of either dejection or fatigue.
Okay.
The raggedness, the ripped shirt, sleeving, the whole body language.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of things there. So if you start off by the look, that face, not very clear, but you had kind of a sense there. And then you mentioned the body language as well as the clothing. Okay, so not very happy there. What other things might we be able to say about him? Yep.
That he's the owner of the shovel.
And what makes you say that?
I think location.
Okay.
But also because he appears to be tired. So I want to say that he used the shovel.
That he used the shovel.
Rocky, so
Okay.
it's difficult to dig.
Okay. So that proximity and his look, you're connecting him very much with the shovel, and the fact now we can see a little bit more of the kind of pile and the rocks behind that, so that he's been, so are you saying that you think that he's been digging and he's stopped now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And you probably were already talking about this a little bit as you were talking about him, thinking about how this new information that we've got, how this begins to kind of change our developing story. Is there someone who's kind of developing a story about who this is, where this is, what this is? Yep.
He looks like a 49er, California miner.
A California miner, okay. And what made you say 49er in particular?
That's the big thing in American history, and I saw the shovel, but I didn't see a pan, and I thought, And then when I see them now, because it was very frustrating, very few of them made out.
Okay. So making that connection to some history that you know, bringing that kind of forward and saying, is there anything about his dress that reminds you of?
Yeah,
okay. Okay. So that the hardship, and you remember that era, and so you're thinking that maybe this is gold digging. Anyone else have a different story that might be developing? Yes?
When you had the first left-hand slice, that dark kind of curve that goes off out of the picture, I was trying to figure out, is that a haystack? Is that dim? But now that you get, in the very background, you can see, I believe now it's the base of a tree, but I was thinking that figure is like coming back to you. But now that you get this again, you see that clearly a trunk of a tree right behind him, and it sort of develops the tree that I was thinking maybe the person, and now I'm thinking the haystack on is another trunk is curving with the running behind him curving. So it's starting to give me more of a sense of the setting of where he is, that it's a slightly wooded area, but he's not in a field.
Okay.
That I was looking at first, that there's trees, and I have this sense of like the taquito famine kind of thing, but I kind of think that why are there so many trees around here?
Okay, so you've got things that are kind of playing against each other. So the field story matched a little bit with the potato famine, and now you're saying the trees not so much, and making you kind of question that. So, okay, interesting. Okay, let me show you a little bit more here. Okay, and again, talk with your partner. What new things do you see? Okay, again, we'll come back together. I actually want to focus this time on that last question about what questions is this new detail kind of raising for you. So did anyone have some big questions that kind of began to bubble up as that new detail was?
It looks to me like perhaps a body underneath the blanket there, and so has this been an act of violence? Has this been a result of a famine? Why? What happened?
Okay, and what made you say body? And is this what you're? Okay. Okay. And so it sounds like that also then very much changed the story that was unfolding in your mind. So now it's looking at even more foreboding, not just kind of digging for gold. So maybe, so now, and you said it looks like a body. Are you at this point kind of hesitant about that? Like it does kind of look that way, but you don't yet have enough evidence to feel confirmed? Okay, all right. Okay, which is great. Okay, so there's still some, so that's a question, some ambiguity. It looks like a body, but you would like some more confirmation about that. Other questions which came up?
Portions of the piece on the right seem larger, at least different from the piece on the left. So I can't quite imagine what's going to be bridging the two ends.
Okay, so you've got questions there about perspective and kind of how that's relating and that background. So we don't see nearly as much background on the left, but we're seeing a lot more background on the right. So you've got some questions about that. Other things? Yes?
We see camels.
Okay. Do you want to tell us? You want to tell us where some?
The white, it almost looks like a saddle, or a camel saddle, and that suggests that then the figure to the left of that is maybe the rear end of another camel with its legs tucked under, and you see kind of a fuzzy hump. So then the fabric in the front, which immediately I was drawn to first and thought it was covering a dead body, now became more circus-like to me. Because it's got the most color of anything going on here with a little red stripe and green and maybe blue or whatever.
Okay.
So, and I know that to put up a circus or a traveling fair of some sort, you've got the laborers that have to haul the stuff and put up the tents and do the heavy lifting. So maybe what's going to go in the middle is more positive than the color.
A huge Ferris wheel.
Clearly the guy on the left is still not having a good day.
Okay. So interesting. How many, just curiosity, how many people saw camels? Okay, so a lot of people, and then lots of people did, and some people didn't. And so, and you're connecting that camels now to some things you know, so connecting them to the circus and that connection. Okay, show you a little bit more. Okay. So again, discuss those three questions with your partner there. Okay, again, let's pull back together and talk a little bit about what you see. So who do you think these people are? Where do you think this might be? What's that developing story which you have now in your mind about this? Did this confirm the dead body for you or not?
Well, I can't decide if he's deceased or suspect.
Okay, so you got the body part, but not quite sure whether he's dead or alive. Okay, but which way are you leaning now?
Oh boy, I think I will still stick with. I think I'll stick with dead.
Okay, right. Yep.
When they said camel, they had these ladies that thought it was camels too. I didn't see that, but I definitely, it can't be the desert because of the foliage, and he's European looking. He's not,
Okay. So it sounds like a question's emerging in your mind that you're seeing things which don't fit for you.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with the environment that you want to place the camels in the desert, but I know in American history they did bring camels into the southwest and try them out.
And they're doing that. Okay. Other things, yeah.
We got maybe a little bit more information about time of day or night, perhaps the moon or
Okay.
at least the sun.
Well, what do you think that is? Is it the moon or the sun?
Maybe instead of being currently dead, maybe he's currently asleep.
Okay.
He's having to.
And what makes you say, moon rather than sun?
I think because of the darkness of the picture.
The darkness.
The shadows from the moonlight.
Okay. So you're feeling that things are getting darker rather than things are brightening up within that? So that kind of sense of that? Okay. All right. Well, let me show you the rest of the image here. Okay. And again, with your partner, talk about at this point. So what things do you feel like you know for sure at this point? Okay, again, let's come back together. So what things do you feel like you can say positively now? What things are you pretty confident of that you know?
I retracted that statement.
Okay, so you're pretty confident about not dead now, sleeping, and what makes you say that?
Well, because there's a gentleman there, head down like the other guy. It makes me think, okay, he's not just alone, that no one left, and that one of the things worn out, like a draggle, and this other guy's just wiped out.
Okay, so there's this tiredness, and the tiredness kind of fits with sleeping more than dead. Okay. Other things that you feel like you're pretty confident of?
I'm pretty sure they're not happy.
Pretty sure they're not happy, okay? And what makes you say that?
The facial expressions, the body, the posturing definitely doesn't look like a joyous occasion at all.
Okay, all right, great. Other things that you're pretty confident of?
Well, the graffiti on the tree trunk indicates death, 3 feet, or treasure. This was some kind of treasure they were seeking, and now they have, realized it's not there, or someone got their purse.
Okay, so you've got a very different story going now. So digging treasure, and you're thinking that the inscription on the tree was something with that. So they're dejected about that. Okay, and you've got some. What questions and puzzles remain for you? Yep.
The animals don't match the environment. It'd be like putting one of us in, a strange environment.
Okay.
Wouldn't fit in.
Okay, so you've still got a question about those camels there. Other questions and puzzles that kind of remain around that. Yep.
I'm looking at the rolls, the bed rolls, or whatever they're carrying, and a can of some kind, and I'm wondering if we're in Australia all of a sudden, and we're, these are, I wonder why this guy is so rapid, and
Okay.
where's everybody
And what makes you say Australia?
Well, just, you know, the Billabong and that whole, you know, there are places like this.
Okay.
And camels were commonly used before they built Trans-Australia Railway. That's why they have wild camels running all over.
And that. Okay, so that makes the camels fit for you, that idea if it's Australia and that idea within that. The title of the image is Arrival of Burke, Wills, and King at the Deserted Camp at Cooper's Creek, Sunday evening, 21st April, 1861. This image comes from the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia within that. And this does represent a very famous historical event in Australian history. In 1860, the Australian government offered a prize for the first explorer to go to transverse Australia, going from south to north, from Melbourne, Australia, all the way up to the north. And Robert Burke put together a team, and in the middle of Australia, in the outback, halfway in between Melbourne and the coast up north, they stopped and made camp at Cooper's Creek. And he was nervous that another team was going to beat him to get there, and even though he'd only gone halfway. So he split his team and had 4 of them stay behind at Cooper's Creek, and he asked them to wait for 3 months. And he, and with Wills and King and Gray, went up north, and it took them 2 months until they got to the ocean. 2 months, and then they turned around, and it took them 2.5 months to come back. The team was told to wait, you know, for 3 months. They waited for 18 weeks. And when they left on April 21st. And they packed provisions, they buried them in the ground, and they wrote this inscription, "Dig 3 feet to the west." And they left the provision, they left a note saying where they went. The team, which had waited there at Cooper's Creek for 18 weeks, left 9 hours before Burke, Wills, and King arrived. So they had just dug up and found that they had just missed the party that had waited all this time for them. And eventually they all died except for King within that. So it was an expedition gone bad. There's even more to it. It gets more dramatic and all of that. But this, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, because it's all focused in the beginning on the details, but if you really pull back, way back from this picture, it's so conventionally European art. It's, you know, white men in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certain big picture story to it, which could be on the American continent. And I mean, it's a white man out in the wilderness and the conventions of European artistic style to tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of interesting to me to kind of dig into a story we couldn't really possibly really gotten, but then also to pull way back. To say, you know, there's kind of a bigger canvas that this fits into.
Right, and I think that that's one of the powers, actually, of this routine of the zoom in, is that you're able to build a story and to actually look at things in kind of a different way. So I want to go back to those 4 things, those 4 criteria that we were looking at about what really makes a powerful learning opportunity within this. And so what things did you notice? Were any of these present in what we just did with that zoom in, with the Longstaff painting? Did you notice any of those things being a part of that?
The novel application, because we had to use our prior knowledge.
Okay, so a chance to constantly bring prior knowledge kind of with that, okay, and doing that, interpreting with it. So it wasn't just practicing something you already knew, so there was that sense that you were, the novelness to that. Did you feel like you were building some new understanding? Okay. Right? And clearly, in using the zoom in, the learning doesn't stop just because I told you the story of Burke and Wills. I would use this in the classroom to actually extend more learning. So, okay, what are some more things about this? But it's a very good hook to begin to kind of engage students within that that effective communication. So the idea that you were constantly talking with a partner about what it is you were seeing and what it is you were noticing, constantly coming back to the evidence and the reasons behind that. And the evidence and reasons were very key within that. Now, this doesn't have any kind of grand application like, translating documents for the local community, as Leslie was doing. But that sense of intrinsic value can also just be a sense of appreciation that's developing as you get into something and as you begin to pull kids into a story within that sense of having value in its own within that. I want to show you, and this one I'm going to go through real quickly. We actually aren't going to discuss, but I wanted to show you that the Longstaff painting was a very narrative story. And as was pointed out, it was in some ways a very kind of conventional European portrait of that. So I just wanted to show you how this might look with a different image with it, and how the questions might be different. So instead of looking at and developing a story, you could focus in on color, shapes, and lines. And what things do you kind of see there? And think about the feeling or mood that are created from that. And then I might reveal another bit of the image. Think about the new colors, lines, and shapes that are there. What's similar, what's remained the same, what's new within that. Again, thinking about what's the mood that's being conveyed, the feeling from that. Show you another bit. Again, talk about similarities and differences there. And again, focusing still on the mood there. A bit more of the image. And think about how that detail, how that connects with what things you've already identified within that. Asking you to begin to think about, try to imagine the rest of the painting at this point. Maybe a little bit more. Think about, well, how do those buildings add to the story? How does that add to the sense of place that's beginning to evolve for us? Reveal that. And then some questions here, thinking about the impression of this particular place and time that's being conveyed within it. So instead of using this painting as a narrative, which the Longstaff painting very much was capturing a scene, there was a clear narrative that went with that image. But then this is just much more about a place, much more about the art, much more about kind of what is the artist doing. This image is from the collection here at the Smithsonian. It's called Wild West by Emile Armin. And I'm from Santa Fe, so I was very pleased to find this in the collection within that. And so when Armin went there in the 1920s. Santa Fe's been around. Last year we celebrated our 400th year as a city. Next year, New Mexico celebrates 100 years as a state. So it hasn't been a state very long. It's been around for a long time. And so when Easterners came, they found this a very engaging place, both because of the light, because of the different culture that was in there. Emile Armin painted 20 paintings within that. And his idea was try to capture the essence of the place, and that idea of kind of focusing on the mood was kind of a key part within that. So a couple of tips on thinking about how to create these zoom-ins that I want to kind of share with you. Things that I think about in terms of doing this is, the first question, think about, what is it that you want students to really understand or appreciate about this image? So what is there to understand and appreciate? So in the Cooper's Creek painting, that idea that we really want students to, want to kind of get into this narrative, get into the story within that. But in the Armin painting, there's something different, that idea of capturing a sense of place and how that place might be different, how it might play out with a different audience within that. The second one there is to think about, what questions would you like students to begin to ask? Because using imagery can be really powerful in getting students to begin to ask questions that can further study and further the focus of the unit within that. So what questions might you be wanting to try to provoke from that image within that? A third thing to think about is, I often think about, where is there ambiguity where can I kind of create some intrigue? So I don't want to reveal the whole image at the same time. So I chose to focus on that shovel to begin with because it was very ambiguous. It created lots of different things. I didn't reveal all of the camels, but part of the camels to create that kind of ambiguity within that. And so there's an idea about thinking about what order are you going to begin the reveals in and how might that work. And the last thing to think about is to think about how might you isolate elements within that. So you have to begin to do some noticing kind of within that. So you're telling a different story and you're using the reveals of the zoom in to both kind of capture and engage students in that ongoing process of looking carefully, noticing, building up evidence to kind of tell the story within that. So I want to give you a chance very, very quickly to put these to practice. So I'm going to show an image, and this again is from the collection here at the Smithsonian. It's called A Dog Swap. And with your partner, would you think about those 4 things? And think about if you were to create a zoom in with this image, how might you go about it? What things might you reveal first? What things would you cover? So do a little bit of talking about how you might see that operating. Okay, let's come back together here. So I love the fact that I saw lots of people holding up their books and their notepads and things to kind of cover up bits and pieces of the image and see how that might look. And, you know, one of the things that's really remarkable is that, you know, I mean, we are so used to always seeing the whole thing when we look at a work of art, that when you reduce it and when you only see part, you begin to be really focused on that one bit and you begin to see things differently. And often what happens then is you begin to notice relationships. That, oh, things are related in a way which hadn't been, you know, completely obvious. What did some people come up with as you were thinking about how you might begin this process? What were some of the ideas that you came about where there might be some ambiguity or tension or interest here?
I think I was trying to picture what might revealed would really change the story. So the gun is a very powerful when you reveal that, it changes the story. The dogs, I think, change the story, depending on what you've seen already.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. So thinking again about those individual elements and how the individual elements have certain kind of connotations with them, that in isolation they bring forth certain things, but then in relationship they begin to change that. Yeah, really interesting. Other ideas?
Dogs are like their owners. Look, the one on the left, he's at attention, and so is the man, like, and the other one's like resting, and so is his dog.
Ah, okay. So again, thinking about that relationship between them within that. Yes?
We talked about over on this side where the cabbage is so clearly portrayed, but behind that is this figure that's in shadows and sort of slumping, you know, and so stylistically there's a difference, but also what's going on there.
Okay.
What's with that figure that's in the shadows.
So, and that's probably one of the more ambiguous things in that whole image is, you know, I mean, you can't see a face. You've got a very different posture turned away from the group. So lots of questions potentially thinking about there and that. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is the importance of questions. As we create those powerful opportunities, Zoom In was built on questions, and that's a very key part about asking the right questions and thinking about what kinds of questions do I want to ask. Within the classroom, as we design activities, as we design things, and we're really creating those opportunities, what really makes those opportunities come alive are the questions that we ask of students and the way that we engage students through questions. And this has been an area of my research for the past couple of years. So I want to share with you briefly what we've been finding about teacher questions, and also you'll see some connection back to the Zoom In within that. So in looking at classrooms, there are lots of people who have looked at questions. There are many different ways you might parse them. We came up with 5 categories of questions that we notice teachers asking. And one is teachers ask review questions. So this is reviewing terminology, content, facts, skills, you know, who can tell me what we did yesterday, You're reviewing those kinds of things within that. Another set of questions that teachers ask are procedural questions, and these have to do with the work. By definition, by our definition as researchers, procedural questions don't have anything to do with the content. There are questions like, does everybody have their pencil? Is everybody ready to go? It's not about the content, it's about the management of the class. Getting away with that. Procedural questions for that. Is everybody with me? Can we go on? All about those kinds of things. The third set, generative questions. And generative questions fell into two types. They could either be essential questions, those big questions which kind of drive a sense of inquiry about what is it that drove explorers to settle the West. So could be those big essential questions which drive an entire unit, or another kind of generative question are authentic questions. And these are questions about the content to which the teacher doesn't already know the answer. They're the single rarest questions that are asked in classroom. They represent generally less than 1% of teachers' questions, authentic questions within that. And the reason for that is, well, it's very hard to ask questions about content that you don't already know because you're teaching the content. And yet, what other researchers, Martin Nystrom has found, is that more than any other type of question, when a teacher asks an authentic question, it bumps up the learning in a class. And the reason for that is that when a teacher asks an authentic question, the teacher is signaling their own curiosity about the topic. All of a sudden the teacher says, hey, I never thought about that. I wonder if that's true. All of a sudden everyone in the class realizes, oh, the teacher doesn't even know that. Oh, we've stumbled on something new, and everyone becomes engaged, and so it bumps up learning within that. Fourth type there, constructive questions. So these are the questions that are about building understanding. And so in the zoom in, we were really looking at those kinds of questions that would help to build understanding. So asking constructive questions, that idea of interpreting, connecting, linking, really building understanding there. And the last set are what are called facilitative questions. And these are about uncovering the learner's thinking. So that question, you saw it pop up several times on the slides, and you heard me asking it, what makes you say that? That's a facilitative question. Getting the student to begin to reveal their thinking, the evidence, their reasoning behind those. So these 5 set of questions, we've looked at classrooms and looked at how these play out in classrooms within that. In the zoom-ins, they're pretty much focused on asking constructive questions and facilitative questions of moving that forward within that. Just to give you a very brief snapshot of what this looks like is we looked at classrooms. The standards-based classrooms were classrooms where teachers were told and instructed, evaluated on teaching for the test. Basically, these classrooms look like test prep. We know what the test is. It's about getting kids to pass the test. It's about doing that. Those, some people might call those traditional classrooms. Some people are calling them standards-based classrooms within that. And then classrooms of teachers we're working with in which they were focused on the thinking. And here's briefly what it looks like. And what we see is, we do see this difference in terms of review questions that are being asked there. So in the thinking classrooms, teachers ask, these are percentages, they ask fewer review questions. They also ask fewer procedural questions. But the big difference comes in they really ask many more facilitative questions. It's about pushing students to think, and it's about making sure that they reveal their thinking and their ideas. And just like Fred Newman's work showing that powerful learning opportunities, authentic intellectual activity actually prepared kids better for tests of basic skills, what our research has shown is that when students are thinking and they're engaged in thinking-based classrooms, when they're engaged in actually expressing their thinking, students' performance on tests also does better, because this is really about consolidating understanding, learning to communicate, and that has a really high transfer rate to students in terms of their test. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll turn it over to some questions.
I'm not sure this is exactly a question, but I'm interested in this, in terminology of zooming in.
Yes.
That you've described, but I want to know if, to what extent you've investigated or would be interesting to take that image once you zoom in to zoom out and to add in to that kind of lesson. Okay, well, let's add in this is 1861. Let's add in this was Australia. Then go research what might have been happening in Australia in 1861, and then zoom out from there and, what are white, in other words, well, I'm just asking you,
Yeah.
has there been, do you have a parallel lesson component to the zooming in, which is then the zooming out to the big historical picture?
Well, where I would connect that is, I put up there one of the points about thinking about what questions do you want to provoke within that. And if you think about that the zoom in and the image isn't, that's only a starting point. That's kind of a hook. And one of the things, we know that questions really drive learning. So, okay, we got that really, nice ambiguity about why are there camels here and why does that fit and all of that. And so getting that out as a question, and what I might do in the classroom, which I didn't do here, is actually as those are coming up, document those so that we've kind of captured those. And then particularly some of those things, and I know, as a teacher, where are some of the really rich resources, where are some of the questions that would really be kind of engaging. So, okay, so this is an image of one set of explorers. But I could easily say, okay, so, let's research some other explorers. And, this is also an image about kind of missed opportunity within that, and we might pick up on that. So you're right, picking up on those questions and thinking about where you might go on an inquiry is really where this needs to go. Rather than, that's right. So rather than seeing, this is an activity, oh, we just did it, didn't we just have fun? You really want to use it as a launching pad, not as an end. And you're right, picking up on those questions is really key for that. Yes.
In your research at Harvard with that Project Zero, what are the top 3 or 5 qualities you saw in an effective teacher? And I put that in quotes because what you consider effective, I might not. I've taught 36 years, and I always felt teachers are just facilitators. Turn the kid on to learning, and they'll fly. Give them, the direction, that they could possibly go. I never felt my total job was just to impart information. I didn't like doing that. That's why I think a lot of American teachers are having trouble with these standards. They're taking the creativity out of our jobs. Mm-hmm. So what are the characteristics or qualities you feel are, the best for an effective teacher in this research? Obviously questions, right?
Well, we do notice a big difference in terms of questions. So actually, this came about, and the reason why we focus on questions. So in my project, the Cultures of Thinking project, we've been working with a huge group of public school teachers in Michigan over the years, and we asked them, okay, so as you're working with these ideas, which involved a lot of thinking routines, but involves, really building a classroom culture that supports thinking, we asked them very simply, how is your classroom changing? And what they told us, the number one way classrooms were changing is they said, the conversation changes. My language changes, the questions I ask. And we kept getting this over and over again, year after year from teachers. So we went into classrooms to think about, okay, well, how is it that we can research and how is it we can identify how this is changing? And that's how we came up with this. So we didn't come up with this framework and say, here are what we think are the 5 kinds of questions teachers should be asking. Here's what we think it's going to be. Teachers were telling us, this is how our classroom's changing. The conversation that we have with kids is different. Kids' participation in those conversations is different. And so we looked at that, and so that actually emerged from the teachers themselves. What I would say, you're absolutely right that word effectiveness, what does that mean, and how are people kind of defining that? I like to think about the animating core. What is it that animates good teachers? What is it that drives us forward? And so what I would say, are real animating cores is this idea of making students' thinking visible. Because unless you know how students are thinking, you don't have the slightest chance of knowing to what extent they really understand something. You have to get, you can give a test where kids just give an answer. That tells you what they know. To really find out what students understand, you have to get into their thinking. How are they putting ideas together? So that's an animating core. The idea of teaching for understanding is also recognizing that, it's all about understanding, that skills and knowledge are connected to that understanding, but that's a real animating core, for teachers. So I think those two things is the real things that I see really, so teachers that take that on and recognize, teaching for understanding is never a simple process. It's an ongoing struggle. Making students thinking visible is never simple. It's ongoing things. And the teachers that are captivated by that and are energized from that, and that animates what they do, that's what I see in really effective classrooms within that. Yes?
My question is sort of along the lines of what he was also asking. In our state, Florida, there's a lot of emphasis on state testing, on state assessments and determining, in fact, now there's issues whether teachers will be, part of their salary is going to be determined on how well the children do on these tests. And so I wanted to ask you, were you finding in the classrooms that the teachers that you were seeing are asking less review questions and more of the constructive and facilitative questions? And the reason I'm asking that is I love the part of us using the constructive and the facilitating questions. But at the end of the day, what our state wants to see is the results of the test, which deals a lot with the review of information. So do you see a lot of the teachers in the classrooms that you have worked with using less review questions or more constructive and facilitative?
They do use fewer review questions, fewer procedural, and then much more constructive and facilitative questions. And just like Fred Newman's work, who shows really, preparing kids even for basic skills test, it isn't just practice the skills within that, that linking that to bigger ideas, linking that to more authentic intellectual activity is really key within that. One of the things, we've got all of this emphasis on testing. The background story that is unfolding across the country is that we've got a real problem with student engagement. We've got a huge dropout rate in this country. And part of that dropout rate is, I think, caused by a teaching for the test. That is not engaging to kids. Let me see, I was going to put up, the new book, the subtitle of it was, fostering engagement, understanding, and independence for all students, because that's what really motivates learning. So if you get kids engaged in their learning, they're going to do better in the long run within that. Sorry, let me get more with the, so that's the, I did get it right, how to promote engagement, understanding, and independence for all learners. That those are the things, that's what's really going to keep kids learning within that. That when students feel like their ideas matter, when they feel like they're respected, when they feel like there's something to learn here, it's not that the skills and the knowledge, it's not like, oh, just push those to the side and they don't count, but you embed those in a more meaningful context, in that novel application for that. So kids feel like they are, yes, they're using their skills, but they're using it to create something new rather than just practicing within that. And so, both Newman's research and our research, the one of the things that's emerged very strongly from our research is that idea of making thinking visible really connects to effective communication. And what we see is across the board and across different countries, we are seeing both in elementary as well as secondary that students' writing performance is really affected by students using these ideas, that students are really outperforming in the elementary school one of the schools that I work with in the state of Michigan, on their test, they were the highest scoring school in writing in the entire state by 10 points. And everyone started calling this principal saying, what's your writing program? He said, it's not a writing program. We're working with the cultures of thinking ideas, and we're working to make students' thinking visible, and that's spilling over. That focusing on students communicating and talking and using language is having a real spillover effect on writing. And then we're seeing it at the senior level schools, both here in the States as well as in Australia, where those very high stakes exit exams in Australia, and teachers are reporting, we're getting the highest scores that we've ever gotten from that, particularly around writing. And that's not our goal. My research isn't about how to help kids do better in tests, but I've always believed that good teaching isn't going to make kids do poorly on tests. Good teaching, again, about engagement and about understanding, it's going to serve double duty. Kids are, you want kids engaged. You want kids engaged in learning within that, and that's going to have that spillover effect within that.
I'm going to ask for a spoiler for your book, because you just touched on something that is near and dear to my heart, which is writing, student writing. I teach in Maryland, and our Maryland School Assessment Program that's been in place for many years has essentially been a reading test from grades 3 through 8. And as a result, students that come to me in high school can't write. They can read, but they can't write about what they read. And I kind of have to bridge that gap before they get to college. And I care, and I think students can become better writers. So I'm wondering in your book whether you address that writing is an essential component of learning in all classrooms, because what I'm going to try to work on, one of the things I'd like to work on, is transforming back to writing across the curriculum. I mean, that went away, but now it's back. And I would be interested to know how much your book addresses that.
Well, we didn't focus on writing, and our work hasn't focused on writing. This has actually been one of the things that's been emerging over the past 2 years. That we never set out. We never thought that this will have any dramatic effect on test scores. We thought this is good teaching. This will have an effect, and what we do is we see there is a huge effect in terms of student engagement, greater student independence. Within that, we do see those effects, and we thought, those are very worthwhile effects. Those are things which we should be striving for. But then schools and teachers began telling us these things were happening to their test scores. And so, again, I make that connection that, what the book is about, how do we make students' thinking visible? How do we document that thinking, which involves often a lot of writing, and a lot of the routines do ask kids to write and communicate. But a lot of times, the communication of ideas comes first before the writing. And I think that makes a very dramatic effect for many, many students, that many students have a traditional kind of writer's block. They're asked to write something and do that, and they haven't had the time to organize their thoughts and their thinking. And so students are beginning to recognize the thinking routines actually are something that you use, not the teacher doesn't just use, but I use them as a learner myself to consolidate my ideas. And I think that's where a lot of the carryover is, that we notice students actually independently using the strategies and routines because they found them very useful scaffolds for their own thinking as pre-writing activities. We didn't design them that way, but that's what we're finding out, is that students are using them that way.